A shiver ran through the vast chamber as the holographic display in the center flickered to life, bathing the room in a cold, ghostly blue light. The faces of the coalition leaders reflected the glow, their expressions carved with weariness and unspoken dread. From the curved walls of the chamber, faint murmurs echoed like the whispers of ghosts, echoes of lives already lost in a war that seemed infinite. Commander Elias Vaynor stood at the edge of the room, silent and still, like a shadow cast by the weight of the galaxy's grief. He adjusted the collar of his worn uniform, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and the scent of charred metal clinging to it, a souvenir from the last doomed battle. He had no seat at the table of the coalition, no formal place in their hierarchy. Humanity, as always, was seen as the outsider, a fire in a council of ice. "Project the status of the outer colonies," said High Marshal Veltrin, his voice dry as paper cracking in the wind. The hologram shifted, tendrils of red unfurling across the galaxy like veins of spilled blood. Entire sectors pulsed crimson, lost, consumed by the Ogren Hive. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound, but the crushing roar of despair. Elias stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished obsidian floor, the sound startling against the tension. He paused, letting the council notice him. His gray eyes scanned the room, taking in every exhausted figure. Admiral Ketria, slumped in her chair with her golden scales dulled to ash. Minister Deck, his furred hands trembling as he gripped the armrest of his seat. Even the defiant Tyrus Vecron, the coalition's loudest critic of humanity, kept his 8 eyes fixed on the table, refusing to meet Elias's gaze. "You've already lost," Elias said, his tone low but steady, slicing through the air like the edge of a blade. The murmurs erupted into full protests, voices rising in a cacophony of indignation and denial. "How dare you? The nerve! Human arrogance!" Elias raised a hand, his fingers scarred from years of battlefield command. "You called me here because you know it's true, and deep down, you know your strategies have failed." Admiral Ketria hissed, her frills snapping upright. "We do not need your lectures, human. Your species barely contributes to this war, yet you strut in here as if I'm the only one willing to tell you the truth," Elias cut her off, his voice like iron striking stone. "Your fleets are scattered, your defenses thin, and your enemy," he gestured to the crimson tendrils that now bled toward the coalition's heart, "isn't slowing down. They're accelerating." High Marshal Veltrin leaned forward, his bone-white skin catching the hologram's glow. "Then enlighten us, Commander. If you're so certain we're doomed, what do you propose?" Elias exhaled slowly, his breath laced with the faint tang of recycled air. He stepped closer to the hologram, its cold light illuminating the sharp lines of his face, weathered but unyielding. "You're fighting a war of preservation," he said, his voice softening, not with kindness, but with the weight of bitter understanding. "You're clinging to your territories, to your pride. But the Ogren Hive doesn't care about your borders or traditions. They consume, adapt, and move on. And they'll keep doing it until nothing's left. And what would you have us do, Commander?" Tyrus's voice dripped with venom, his mandibles clicking as he folded his spindly arms. "Sacrifice what little remains of our worlds? Abandon billions to buy you more time?" Elias turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Yes." The word hung in the air, sharp and cold, cutting through the council's protests. He let the weight of it settle, his gaze sweeping over them like a storm over a battlefield. "This isn't about saving every life," Elias continued, his tone relentless now. "It's about ensuring there's a future for any life at all. If that means retreating from the outer colonies to consolidate our forces, so be it. If that means abandoning planets already lost to buy a strategic advantage, so be it. The Hive doesn't leave survivors. What you cling to now will be ash tomorrow." The room fell silent. For a moment, only the faint hum of the hologram filled the void, its rhythmic flicker casting shadows that seemed to deepen the lines of worry etched into every face. Dr. Lyra Antos broke the silence, her voice soft, but firm. "And what advantage would this sacrifice buy us, Commander? You speak of consolidation, but what's your endgame?" Elias turned to her, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. Brief, fleeting, like a spark in the dark. "You'll find I rarely play without an endgame, Doctor." He gestured to the hologram, zooming in on a cluster of stars deep within Ogren-controlled space. "This is the Hive's primary breeding ground, their genesis nodes. If we can take these out, we don't just slow them down, we sever their ability to reproduce entirely." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a sharp intake of breath from Admiral Ketria. "You're proposing genocide." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'm proposing survival. If you want to call it genocide, you're free to. But if you don't act, the Hive will keep doing to you what you refuse to do to them." Tyrus's mandibles clicked furiously. "And how do you plan to reach these nodes, Commander? The Hive defends their inner systems with every resource they have. You're asking us to throw lives into the grinder for a slim chance of—" "No," Elias interrupted. "I'm not asking. I'm offering. Give me command of a fleet, a single fleet, and I'll show you what humans are capable of." The council erupted again, but this time their voices didn't hold the same conviction. Beneath the indignation and outrage lay something else, something fragile and uncertain. Hope. High Marshal Veltrin raised a skeletal hand, silencing the room, his pale, luminous eyes locked onto Elias. "And if you fail, Commander?" Elias stepped closer to the table, his boots echoing once more in the oppressive quiet. "Then you'll lose nothing you weren't already prepared to sacrifice. But if I succeed—" He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "If I succeed, you'll finally have a chance to fight back." Veltrin's gaze lingered on Elias for a long, heavy moment. Then, with a nod as slow and deliberate as a falling star, he said, "Very well. One fleet. But know this, Commander, your success or failure will define the future of this galaxy." Elias inclined his head, the faintest shadow of a smirk tugging at his lips. "That's all I've ever needed." As he turned to leave, the echoes of the council's murmurs followed him like distant thunder. In the corridor beyond, Dr. Antos caught up to him, her voice low. "You didn't tell them the whole plan, did you?" Elias's smirk grew sharper, his gray eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Not yet. They're not ready to hear it." And with that, he strode into the cold, metallic expanse of the Coalition's warship bay, where shadows stretched long, and the distant rumble of engines promised a future still unwritten. The sharp clang of boots against metal echoed through the dimly lit hangar bay. Elias Vaynor moved with purpose, his mind a storm of calculations as he scanned the hulking shadows of battleships looming in the artificial twilight. The air was thick with the scent of fuel and scorched circuitry, and the faint hum of idling engines vibrated in his chest like the growl of a restless beast. Around him, mechanics worked in hurried silence, their movements purposeful, yet weighed down by the same invisible burden gripping the galaxy: inevitability. "Commander!" a voice called out, breaking through his thoughts. It was steady, clipped, precise, like the man himself. Major Cale Strain approached, his uniform immaculate, a stark contrast to the smudges of oil and grime that streaked the faces of those around him. Cale was as much a symbol of order as the galaxy was of chaos. His ice-blue eyes scanned Elias, measuring him with the silent intensity of someone who had learned to trust no one entirely. "The fleet is prepared," Cale said, his tone devoid of flourish. 112 ships, frigates, destroyers, and a single dreadnought. Barely enough to hold a defensive line, let alone execute whatever this is. "It's enough," Elias replied, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. He let the words settle between them as his gaze moved to the dreadnought at the far end of the bay. Its hull gleamed under the cold white lights, pockmarked from previous battles, yet standing like an ancient fortress. The ironclad. It would serve as their flagship, and their last hope. Cale hesitated before speaking again, his voice softer. "They don't trust you, you know. The council, the crew, even some of our own. They're terrified you'll lead them into another slaughter. Elias turned to him, his expression as unyielding as the steel walls surrounding them. Trust isn't what wins wars, Kale. It's preparation. The major nodded, but his frown deepened. And if this fails, if the council gets even a whiff of weakness, they'll pull support faster than you can. It won't fail, Elias interrupted, his tone sharper now. It can't. Before Kale could press further, a familiar voice echoed through the hangar, carrying with it a hint of dry humor. That's comforting, Commander. Always good to know failure isn't an option when it's the most likely outcome. Dr. Lyra Antos approached, her lab coat flaring slightly with each determined step. Her sharp, almond-shaped eyes gleamed with both intellect and exasperation as she reached them. She carried a data pad in one hand, its screen casting faint green light onto her fingers. The faint hum of static followed her, the unmistakable trace of experimental tech she was never far from. "Ah, Doctor," Elias said, allowing a faint smirk. "Here to reassure me with your endless optimism?" "Something like that," she replied, her tone wry. She glanced at Kale before turning back to Elias. "We've completed the final simulations on the Harbinger AI. The results are promising if you're willing to overlook the 73% chance of catastrophic failure." Kale groaned. "Comforting." Elias folded his arms, his expression unreadable. 73% is better than the 100% failure rate of doing nothing. Lyra arched an eyebrow, her smirk tinged with something darker. "Spoken like a man with nothing to lose." The words hung heavy in the air, charged with an unspoken truth. For a moment the three of them stood in silence, the distant clamor of machinery filling the void. Elias finally broke the tension, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't just a gamble. It's a necessity. The Hive has adapted to everything we've thrown at them. If we keep fighting their way, we're already dead." "And what exactly is your way?" Lyra asked, her tone curious but edged with skepticism. Elias gestured toward the ironclad, its silhouette jagged against the light like a blade waiting to be drawn. "Consolidation, efficiency, precision. We abandon the colonies that are already lost and concentrate our forces where they'll matter most. And we use Harbinger to do what no organic mind can: outthink the Hive." Kale's frown deepened. "You're putting a lot of faith in an untested AI." Elias turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "It's not faith. It's calculation." Before either could respond, the hangar's comm system crackled to life, the voice of the comms officer breaking through the static. "Commander Vaynor, your presence is requested on the bridge. The Council has sent an update." Elias nodded, already moving. "Time to see how much faith the Council has in us." The bridge of the ironclad was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the hangar below. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, with only the soft beeps of consoles and the muted conversations of officers breaking the silence. The air was sharp with the metallic tang of sterilized systems, and the faint vibration of the ship's core thrummed beneath their feet like a heartbeat. Elias stepped onto the command platform, his gaze sweeping the room. At the center of the bridge, a holographic display flickered to life, projecting a live transmission from the Coalition Council. High Marshal Veltrin's gaunt visage filled the screen, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "Commander," Veltrin began, his voice cool and detached, "we've reviewed your proposal. The Council remains divided, but for now you have our support. Do not mistake this for trust. It is a chance, a narrow one." "I understand," Elias replied, his tone carefully neutral, "and I won't waste it." "See that you don't," Veltrin said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've been authorized to engage in your operation, but know this: the loss of even one more key system will mean the end of your command. The Council will not entertain failure." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge bathed in the cold glow of the hologram. Elias exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. He turned to his crew, who were watching him with a mixture of anticipation and unease. "Set course for the Delta Expanse," he ordered, his voice steady, It's time to show them what failure looks like when it belongs to the Hive. The officers moved quickly, their hands flying over consoles as the ship came alive around them. Lights dimmed, engines roared to life, and the ironclad began its slow, deliberate ascent. Through the viewport, the stars stretched into streaks of silver as the ship entered its jump sequence. A brief moment of silence swallowing the bridge before the hum of hyperspace filled the air. Elias stood at the viewport, his reflection faint in the glass. Beside him, Lyra approached, her voice softer now. "You really believe this will work?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the stars, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that felt almost ancient. "Belief doesn't matter, Doctor. What matters is that it has to work." Behind them, the bridge crew worked in hushed concentration, their movements precise yet tinged with the undercurrent of tension that came with walking a razor's edge. The ironclad hurtled through hyperspace, carrying with it the hopes of a galaxy teetering on the brink, and the grim resolve of a man who knew the cost of hope better than anyone. As the ship neared its destination, Elias allowed himself one final thought, one he didn't dare speak aloud. This is just the beginning. The worst is yet to come. The stars above Delta Expanse burned cold and distant, their light casting a pale glow over the jagged remains of a shattered moon. The debris fields surrounding the system hung like a cemetery of forgotten wars, silent reminders of countless lives already lost. The ironclad emerged from hyperspace with a shudder that vibrated through the hull, its engines growling as they stabilized in the void. The bridge was alive with activity, officers relaying tactical updates in hushed tones, their voices taut with anticipation. Elias Vaynor stood at the command platform, his gaze fixed on the holographic display that projected the expanse before them. The enemy fleet loomed ahead, hulking, bioorganic monstrosities that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The Ogren Hive's convoy was an unsettling amalgam of living and mechanical, its ships tethered together by sinewy, glowing strands like a colony of parasites feeding off one another. "Distance to the convoy?" Elias asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. 70,000 kilometers and closing," reported Lieutenant Yaren, her hands flying over the navigation console. The faint scent of ozone lingered in the air, a byproduct of the ship's power surges as systems came online for battle. "Commander," Major Cale Strain said from his station, his voice steady but grim, "we're picking up energy fluctuations from the Hive ships. They know we're here." "Good," Elias replied, his tone colder than the void outside. "Let them see us coming. Helm, reduce speed to 1/3. Keep our formation tight. Weapons, load rail charges, and prepare EMP bursts on my mark." The crew moved with synchronized precision, their actions honed by weeks of relentless preparation. Yet beneath the surface of their discipline lay an undeniable tension, an electric current of fear and determination. The faint hum of the ship's system seemed to echo the beating hearts of everyone on board. The convoy came into sharper focus on the display, its monstrous shapes twisting unnaturally as they adjusted their trajectory. The Hive ships radiated an eerie luminescence, their surfaces writhing with what looked like veins pumping some unholy mixture of energy and life. Elias clenched his fists behind his back, his jaw tightening. The Hive wasn't just an enemy, it was an abomination, a perversion of life itself. "They're forming a defensive screen," Cale observed, his eyes narrowing. "If we hit them head-on, we'll be walking into a meat grinder." "Then we don't hit them head-on," Elias said, stepping closer to the display. "We flank their rear. Their supply vessels are slower and less defended. If we take those out, their warships lose fuel and resources." "That's assuming we can break through their screen," Cale said, his skepticism barely veiled. "Harbinger," Elias called, turning to the AI interface embedded in the console. The holographic avatar of the AI flickered into existence, a shifting, abstract form of glowing blue lines that pulsed faintly with each syllable it spoke. "Yes, Commander?" Harbinger's voice was calm, clinical, and faintly androgynous. "Run predictive simulations. What's the probability of success if we deploy decoy drones to distract their vanguard? Harbinger processed for a brief moment before responding. Simulated success probability, 41%. Recommended adjustment, deploy drone squadron alongside timed EMP bursts to disorient Hive bioships. Predicted success probability increases to 67%. Elias nodded. We'll take it. Helm, adjust course for flanking maneuvers. Drone Squadron Alpha, prepare for deployment. Understood, Commander, Lieutenant Yeren replied, her voice tinged with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. The lights on the bridge dimmed slightly as the ship's systems reallocated power to weapons and shields. A faint vibration rippled through the deck as the ironclad accelerated toward its new trajectory. Through the viewport, the debris field loomed closer, the fragments of ancient battles casting long shadows across the starlight. Elias turned to Lyra, who stood at a secondary console monitoring the Harbinger AI's integration. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You're betting everything on this AI," she said quietly. "What happens if it's wrong?" "Then we adapt," Elias said, his tone firm but not unkind. "That's what humans do." Before she could respond, the comm system crackled to life. "Enemy ships are redirecting," an officer called from the tactical station. "They're moving to intercept our flank." "They're faster than we calculated," Cale muttered, his expression darkening. Elias stared at the hologram, his mind racing. The Hive was responding faster than expected, its ships closing the distance with an unnatural fluidity. For a moment, doubt flickered at the edges of his resolve. Then he shoved it aside. "Launch the decoys," he ordered. "EMP bursts on my signal." The drones deployed from the ironclad, small and sleek, their reflective surfaces designed to mimic larger vessels. They spread out in a wide formation, their propulsion systems leaving faint trails of ionized particles in their wake. The Hive ships hesitated, their movements faltering as they redirected their attention to the decoys. "Now," Elias said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. The EMP charges detonated, unleashing a wave of electromagnetic energy that rippled through the enemy formation. The Hive bioships shuddered, their glowing veins dimming momentarily as their systems scrambled to recover. In the chaos, the ironclad and its fleet surged forward, breaking through the weakened defensive screen. "Target the supply vessels!" Elias barked. "All weapons fire at will!" The ship's railguns roared, their projectiles tearing through the alien convoy with brutal precision. Explosions erupted in the void, sending fragments of Hive ships spinning into the darkness. The ironclad shuddered with the recoil of its weapons, the air on the bridge thick with the acrid tang of overheated circuits. "Direct hit on one of their supply vessels," an officer called. "It's destabilizing." Through the viewport, one of the Hive's massive carriers convulsed, its sinewy tendrils snapping as an internal explosion ripped through its core. The shockwave lit up the void, briefly turning the battlefield into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. But the victory was short-lived. The remaining Hive ships regrouped with terrifying speed, their movements now more aggressive, more coordinated. "They've adapted," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias gritted his teeth. "All ships, fall back to the debris field. Use the terrain for cover." The fleet retreated into the jagged expanse of moon fragments, the Hive ships in hot pursuit. The debris field became a deadly labyrinth, with both sides weaving through the floating wreckage in a desperate game of cat and mouse. On the bridge, the tension was palpable, the air heavy with the metallic tang of fear and sweat. Elias's mind raced, searching for the next move. He knew this wasn't sustainable. The Hive would adapt again, and when they did, the Coalition fleet wouldn't stand a chance. "Harbinger," Elias said, his voice tight, "we need an exit strategy." The AI's hologram flickered, its glowing lines shifting rapidly. "Calculating escape vectors. Probability of survival increases if debris field trajectory is weaponized." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Weaponized how?" "Utilize ship-mounted kinetic projectors to destabilize large debris fragments. Projectiles will create a barrier, delaying enemy pursuit. Elias didn't hesitate. "Do it! Target the largest fragments and fire on my command." The ironclad's kinetic projectors hummed to life, their power levels surging as they locked onto the floating debris. The air on the bridge seemed to hold its breath as the crew awaited the order. "Fire!" Elias commanded. The projectors released their payload, sending massive chunks of moon rock hurtling toward the Hive ships. The impact was catastrophic, the debris shattering into smaller fragments that created a dense, shifting barrier between the Coalition fleet and their pursuers. As the ironclad sped away, Elias allowed himself a brief exhale. They had survived, barely. But the cost of this victory was already evident, and the Hive would adapt again. This was only the beginning. Behind him, Lyra spoke, her voice low and grim. "How long can we keep this up?" Elias didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. "Long enough," he said. But even he wasn't sure how much longer that would be. The bridge of the ironclad was heavy with silence, punctuated only by the hum of the ship's systems and the distant creaks of its strained hull. The recent escape had left the crew tense, their nerves frayed like threads pulled too tightly. The sharp tang of burnt circuitry lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic taste of recycled oxygen. Elias Vaynor stood at the command platform, his jaw clenched as he stared at the holographic map before him. The shifting debris field flickered on the display, a fragile barrier between them and the Ogren Hive fleet that still prowled beyond it. Lyra Antos approached, datapad in hand, her expression taut with barely concealed frustration. "We can't keep relying on luck and debris fields to save us, Elias," she said, her voice low but edged with urgency. "The Hive adapts faster than we predict. It's only a matter of time before they find a way to nullify these tactics." Elias didn't look at her. His gray eyes remained fixed on the hologram, unblinking, as though staring hard enough might conjure a solution. "I know," he said, his voice flat but carrying an undertone of determination. "That's why we need to take the fight to them." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Lyra pressed, her tone sharpening. "We're down to half our supply of munitions. The fleet is scattered, morale is tenuous at best, and Harbinger can only calculate so much without actionable data." Elias finally turned to face her, his expression carved from stone. "We strike their Genesis nodes." The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of unease through the crew who had overheard. Even Lyra, who rarely balked at audacity, blinked in surprise. "The Genesis nodes," she repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the idea. "You're serious?" "Deadly," Elias replied, his voice as steady as a drumbeat. He gestured to the hologram, zooming in on a cluster of Hive-controlled systems. The map highlighted a network of faintly glowing structures, interconnected like arteries in a vast, malignant organism. "These nodes are the heart of their reproduction. Every soldier, every ship, every piece of their war machine originates from these points. If we hit them, we don't just slow them down, we cripple them." Lyra frowned, her mind already racing through the implications. "The Genesis nodes are buried deep within their territory. Even if we reach them, the Hive will throw everything they have at us to protect them. This isn't just a suicide mission. It's a calculated annihilation." Elias's gaze hardened. "Then we calculated better than they do." Before Lyra could respond, Major Cale Strain entered the bridge, his strides deliberate, his expression unreadable. "Commander," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension, "Admiral Vekran is requesting a secure channel with you. He insists it's urgent." Elias's jaw tightened. "Of course he does." He turned to Lyra. "Prep Harbinger for a tactical review of our next target. I'll deal with Vekran." Lyra hesitated, her brows knitting. "Are you sure that's wise? He's been vocal about his objections to your command." "I'm not here to be liked, Doctor," Elias replied, already heading for the war room. "I'm here to win." The war room was a stark, circular chamber, its walls lined with glowing tactical displays and maps. The air was colder here, the faint whir of ventilation systems louder in the relative stillness. Elias activated the comm terminal at the center of the room, and moments later, Admiral Tyrus Vecran's holographic form materialized, his 8 eyes glinting with a mixture of disdain and calculation. "Commander Vaynor," Vecran began, his tone clipped and formal. "Or should I say, the human who gambles with lives as though they're game pieces." "Admiral," Elias replied, his tone carefully neutral, "I trust this call is about more than your usual grievances." "It is," Vecran said, leaning forward slightly, his elongated limbs twitching with agitation. "Your plan to target the Genesis nodes, it's reckless, even by your standards. The Hive's defenses around those systems are impenetrable. You'll lead the Coalition into ruin." Elias's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "And what would you suggest, Admiral? Another retreat? Another stalemate while the Hive picks us apart piece by piece?" "We can regroup," Vecran insisted. "Fortify our remaining systems. Buy time to develop countermeasures." "There's no time," Elias cut him off, his voice rising slightly. "The Hive doesn't stop to regroup. They advance, they consume, and they adapt. If we don't take the initiative, there won't be anything left to fortify." Vecran's mandibles clicked in irritation. "And you think humanity's barbaric tactics will be our salvation?" "I think," Elias said, stepping closer to the hologram, "that humanity is willing to do what's necessary. If you can't stomach that, Admiral, then step aside and let me finish this." For a moment, Vecran said nothing, his alien features inscrutable. Then he inclined his head slightly, his tone cooling. "Very well, Commander. I only hope your boldness doesn't become our undoing." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Elias alone in the war room. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a physical burden. Vecran's opposition wasn't new, but it was growing bolder, and Elias knew that dissent within the Coalition could be as deadly as the Hive itself. Back on the bridge, Lyra was waiting with an update. "Harbinger has identified 3 potential targets within the Hive's Genesis node network," she said, handing Elias her datapad. "This one, Node 7, has the lightest defenses, but it's still heavily fortified. If we're going to hit it, we'll need to do it fast and with precision." Elias studied the datapad, his brow furrowing. "What about the fleet's readiness?" "Barely holding together," Lyra admitted. "We're low on munitions, and several ships sustained critical damage during the last engagement. If we're taking this shot, it's all or nothing." Elias nodded, his mind already assembling the pieces of the plan. "We'll use the same principle as before, distraction and precision. Harbinger can simulate a false convoy transmission to draw the Hive's vanguard away from the node. Once they're out of position, we strike hard and fast." "And if they see through the ruse?" Cale asked, his tone grim as he joined them on the bridge. "They won't," Elias said, though his voice carried a flicker of uncertainty. "They haven't adapted to Harbinger's tactics yet." "And if they adapt mid-operation?" Lyra pressed. Elias looked at her, his expression steady but somber. "Then we adapt faster." The crew moved quickly to implement the plan, their movements precise but heavy with the unspoken understanding of what was at stake. On the holographic display, the simulation unfolded. The false convoy lured the Hive fleet away from the node, creating a narrow window for the Coalition to strike. As the ironclad prepared for its jump to Node 7, Elias stood at the viewport, staring into the void. The stars seemed colder now, more distant, as though the galaxy itself was holding its breath. Behind him, Lyra approached, her voice softer than usual. "Do you ever wonder if we're already too late?" she asked quietly. Elias didn't turn. "Every day," he said, "but wondering doesn't change anything. Acting does." The ship shuddered as it entered hyperspace, its engines roaring like the growl of some ancient beast. In the silence that followed, Elias allowed himself one fleeting thought. Vecran wasn't just trying to undermine me. He's planning something. But for now, there was no time to dwell. The next move was already in motion, and failure wasn't an option. Not anymore. The ironclad emerged from hyperspace like a predator slipping into the shadows. The Genesis node loomed ahead, a pulsating construct of organic and metallic tendrils coiled around a small planet. It resembled a grotesque heart, each pulse sending faint waves of energy rippling into the void. The sight was mesmerizing and unnerving, a twisted mockery of creation. On the bridge, the air was thick with tension. Every console glowed faintly, casting faces in a dim greenish light that accentuated the lines of worry etched onto every officer's expression. The faint hum of the ship's systems vibrated through the floor, a steady reminder of the power thrumming beneath their feet. Elias stood at the command platform, his gaze fixed on the holographic projection of the node. "Status report," he ordered, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. "Drone convoy is active," Lieutenant Yaren replied, her hands deftly moving over her console. "Harbinger is transmitting false signatures. Hive forces are beginning to shift toward the decoys." Elias nodded, his expression grim but focused. "Good. Launch the infiltration team." In the ship's belly, the assault team was already boarding their dropship. The scent of metal and disinfectant filled the cramped space, mingling with the acrid tang of sweat. The soldiers moved in tense silence, their armor gleaming faintly under the harsh lights. At the center of the group stood Major Cale Strain, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning each soldier as if memorizing their faces. His own armor bore scars from countless battles, a testament to both his skill and the relentless brutality of their enemy. "We've trained for this," Cale said, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a blade. "Stick to your roles, follow the plan, and we get this done. No improvisation, no hesitation. Understood?" The soldiers responded with sharp nods, their weapons clutched tightly in gloved hands. The dropship's engines roared to life, drowning out the faint murmurs of conversation as it detached from the ironclad and plunged toward the node. On the bridge, Elias monitored their descent, his fingers gripping the edge of the command platform. The hologram displayed the dropship's path in real time, a single green dot cutting through the black void. Around it, faint red blips began to converge, Hive bioships, sleek and grotesque, closing in like sharks scenting blood. "Activate countermeasures," Elias commanded. The ironclad released a barrage of decoy drones, each one emitting bursts of electromagnetic interference. The Hive ships faltered, their movements momentarily disoriented. "Dropship has cleared the perimeter," Yaren reported, relief flickering in her voice. "Hold formation," Elias ordered. "Keep the Hive's attention on us. We give them no reason to look at that dropship." Inside the dropship, the atmosphere was suffocating, the air thick with anticipation. The faint glow of the Genesis node filled the viewport, its pulsating structure casting shifting shadows across the soldiers' faces. The ship shuddered as it entered the node's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the strain of gravitational anomalies. "Approaching the landing zone," the pilot called out, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "Prepare for deployment." Cale rose from his seat, gripping the overhead rail for balance. The soldiers followed suit, their movements precise despite the turbulence. The dropship's ramp hissed open, revealing a landscape that was as alien as it was hostile. The ground was slick and uneven, covered in a fleshy, pulsating substance that seemed to writhe underfoot. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and a faint chemical tang that burned the back of the throat. "Move!" Cale barked, leading the team down the ramp. The soldiers fanned out, their boots squelching against the ground as they advanced toward the node. The structure loomed ahead, its tendrils writhing like the limbs of some massive slumbering beast. Every step closer made the low hum emanating from the node more palpable, a vibration that seemed to seep into their bones. "Entry point located," one of the soldiers reported, gesturing toward a jagged opening in the node's outer shell. The team regrouped, their weapons trained on the dark entrance as Cale signaled for the breach. Inside, the node was a labyrinth of organic corridors, the walls pulsating faintly, as if alive. The air was thick and humid, carrying a faint, acrid tang that clung to the back of the throat. Every step echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. The team moved in tight formation, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and revealing the twisted interior of the Hive's creation. "Stay sharp," Cale murmured, his voice low. "This place isn't empty." As if on cue, a faint skittering sound echoed from the shadows, growing louder with each passing second. The soldiers froze, their weapons trained on the source of the noise. From the darkness emerged Hive drones, smaller than their bioships but no less grotesque, their chitinous bodies glistening in the dim light. Their movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as they charged toward the team with inhuman speed. "Engage!" Kale shouted. The corridor erupted into chaos. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire, the hiss of plasma bolts, and the guttural screeches of the drones. The stench of burning chitin and scorched flesh mingled with the acrid tang of discharged weapons, creating a nauseating cocktail of smells. The soldiers held their ground, their movements precise, as they cut down wave after wave of drones. "Kale, we need to move!" one of the soldiers shouted, reloading his weapon with shaking hands. "They'll keep coming!" "Fall back to the breach point," Kale ordered, his voice rising over the cacophony. The team retreated deeper into the node, their weapons carving a path through the relentless swarm. Every step forward felt like an eternity, the weight of the Hive's presence pressing down on them like a physical force. Finally, they reached the core of the node, a massive chamber filled with pulsating tendrils and glowing sacs that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. "Plant the charges!" Kale barked. The soldiers moved quickly, setting explosive devices along the base of the node's core. The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, as if the node itself was aware of their presence. "Charges set," one of the soldiers called out. "Detonation in 3 minutes," another added, his voice tight with urgency. The team began their retreat, the walls of the node trembling as the Hive reacted to the intrusion. Drones poured into the corridors, their screeches echoing through the labyrinth as they closed in on the fleeing soldiers. On the ironclad, Elias watched the holographic display, his jaw tight as the green dot of the dropship began its ascent. Around it, the red blips of Hive ships converged, their movements frantic. "Hold the line," he ordered. "We're not losing them." The ironclad unleashed a volley of railgun fire, the projectiles streaking through the void and colliding with the Hive ships in bursts of light. The dropship broke through the atmosphere just as the node detonated, the explosion ripping through space in a blinding flash. The shockwave tore through the Hive ships, sending debris spinning into the void. As the dropship docked with the ironclad, the bridge erupted into cheers. But Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed on the hologram. This was a victory, yes, but the Hive would adapt. They always did. "Prepare the fleet," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We're just getting started." The ironclad drifted through the aftermath of the Genesis node's destruction, its hull scarred and its engines murmuring like an exhausted predator. Debris from the node hung in the void, faintly glowing remnants of the Hive's pulsing core now reduced to drifting carcasses. The air aboard the ship was tense, heavy with the mixed scent of recycled oxygen and the faint chemical tang of overheated circuits. The occasional groan of the hull echoed like a wounded beast's growl, reminding everyone just how close they had come to annihilation. Elias Vaynor stood at the central command platform, his hands gripping its edge as he stared at the holographic map. The destruction of the node was a success, but the strategic map before him told a bleaker story. Red markers spread across the galaxy, converging rapidly toward their position. The Hive wasn't retreating, it was reacting, like a severed limb twitching before regrowing with twice the strength. "Commander?" Major Kalestrain's voice broke through the quiet. He stood at Elias's side, his face as rigid as stone, but his eyes shadowed with unease. "Recon drones are picking up multiple Hive fleets inbound. Their numbers, it's worse than we anticipated." "How long?" Elias asked, his voice clipped but calm. 2 hours, maybe less," Kale replied. "They'll be on us before we can get clear of the system." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Around them, the bridge crew worked with frantic precision, their movements hurried but practiced. The faint whir of machinery and the rhythmic beeping of consoles filled the space like a desperate heartbeat. Elias exhaled slowly, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. "Signal the fleet," he said. "We need to consolidate and reposition. We can't outrun them, but we can choose the ground we fight on." "Ground?" Lyra Antos appeared from the rear of the bridge, her expression sharp with incredulity. Her lab coat was streaked with soot, and the faint smell of burnt circuitry clung to her like a reminder of the chaos below. You're suggesting we stand and fight against that? She pointed to the map, where the red markers pulsed ominously. We don't have a choice, Elias said, his tone steady. If we scatter, they'll pick us off one by one. If we run, they'll follow us to our next target. But if we make a stand, one they don't expect, we can turn this into a trap. Lyra's brow furrowed, her sharp mind already racing to dissect his plan. And what kind of trap are we talking about? Because unless you've got a miracle stash somewhere, this fleet doesn't have the firepower to hold off an attack of that scale. We won't need firepower, Elias said. He gestured to the map, highlighting a nearby asteroid field. We'll need ingenuity. The hologram shifted, displaying the asteroid field in detail. Jagged rocks tumbled in slow motion, their surfaces pocked with craters and covered in dense mineral deposits. The field was a natural maze, dangerous to navigate but perfect for ambushes. If we lure the Hive into the field, we can use the terrain to our advantage, Elias explained. Harbinger can calculate optimal firing positions, allowing us to funnel their forces into choke points. And if we collapse key sections of the field, we can cut off their reinforcements. And what about the fleet? Kale asked, his tone skeptical. We'll need them in tight formation to pull this off. One mistake, one collision, and we'll lose half our ships before the Hive even fires a shot. Which is why we'll have to keep our movements precise, Elias replied. He turned to Harbinger's interface, its glowing avatar flickering faintly as it processed his commands. Harbinger, run simulations for defensive formations in the asteroid field. Prioritize minimizing collateral damage while maximizing choke points. The AI's voice echoed through the bridge, calm and analytical. Simulations in progress. Estimated time to completion, 3 minutes. Lyra folded her arms, her expression skeptical, but reluctantly intrigued. And if this works, what then? The Hive will adapt to the field just like they adapt to everything else. Elias met her gaze, his expression unyielding. Then we adapt faster. The fleet moved with eerie precision as it entered the asteroid field, the ships weaving between massive rock formations that loomed like ancient sentinels. The ironclad led the way, its hull battered, but its engines humming with determination. Through the viewport, the asteroids seemed almost alive, their slow rotations casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. On board the smaller frigates and destroyers, the tension was palpable. The faint hum of life support systems and the soft creak of straining hulls were the only sounds as crews manned their stations, their eyes darting between consoles and the view outside. The smell of ozone lingered in the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of fear. Harbinger's simulations are complete, Lyra reported from her station. Her voice was steady, but her fingers betrayed her nerves as they gripped the edge of her console. We've identified 6 key choke points. If we can collapse these asteroids at the right moment, we'll isolate their fleets and force them into concentrated kill zones. Then let's make it happen, Elias said. He turned to Kale. Position the fleet. Keep the frigates near the outer perimeter to draw their fire. Destroyers will hold the choke points. The ironclad will anchor the center. Kale nodded, his jaw tight but his movements precise. Understood. I'll coordinate with the captains. As the fleet settled into position, the Hive appeared on the edge of the field. Their ships moved with unnatural grace, weaving through the asteroids with a fluidity that made them seem less like machines and more like predators stalking prey. Their bioluminescent surfaces glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that danced across the rocks. Contact in 60 seconds, Yaren reported, her voice taut. The air on the bridge grew heavier, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. The faint hum of the engines seemed louder now, a constant reminder of the stakes. Hold steady, Elias said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. Wait for my signal. The Hive ships surged forward, their movements erratic but undeniably coordinated. They closed the distance rapidly, their weapons glowing with deadly intent. The first volley erupted in a blinding flash, plasma streaking through the void and colliding with the outer perimeter of the fleet. Shields holding, Kale reported, though his voice carried a note of strain. For now. Elias watched the display, his eyes locked on the advancing Hive ships. He waited, his fingers tightening on the command platform. The Hive ships moved deeper into the field, their formation narrowing as they funneled through the asteroid-choked corridors. "Now," Elias commanded. The fleet responded instantly. Railguns and missile batteries roared to life, their firepower converging on the choke points. Explosions erupted across the field as asteroids were shattered, their fragments spinning into the Hive formation with devastating force. The Hive ships faltered, their movements disrupted as their formation crumbled. "Keep the pressure on," Elias shouted. "Target their engines and disable their mobility." The bridge was alive with activity, officers relaying commands and adjusting tactics in real time. The smell of ozone thickened as the ship's weapon systems pushed to their limits. Outside, the asteroid field became a chaotic battlefield, the rocks and debris turning into weapons as the Coalition fleet pressed its advantage. The Hive ships retaliated, their weapons carving through the void with relentless precision. One of the frigates exploded in a brilliant flash, its debris scattering into the field. The loss was a gut punch, but the fleet held its ground. "Enemy reinforcements detected," Harbinger reported, its voice cutting through the chaos. "Multiple signatures approaching the perimeter." Elias's jaw tightened. They were running out of time. "Prepare the final strike, collapse the remaining choke points, and disengage." As the fleet executed the final phase of the plan, the Hive's formation disintegrated further. The Coalition ships retreated in tight formation, their movements synchronized as they exited the field. Behind them, the Hive ships struggled to regroup, their forces trapped in the maze of debris. On the bridge, a faint cheer rose as the fleet cleared the field. But Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed on the hologram. The battle was a victory, but the war was far from over, and the Hive would return, stronger and more determined than before. "We bought ourselves time," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the truth. "Now we need to use it." The ironclad limped through the emptiness of deep space, its hull a patchwork of battle scars illuminated by the distant, icy light of stars. Inside, the air was thick with a suffocating stillness, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional groan of straining metal. The crew worked in tense silence, their faces pale under the dim glow of consoles. Victory had bought them time, but it came at a cost that hung over them like a specter. Elias Vaynor stood at the central command platform, his gray eyes fixed on the holographic map before him. The asteroid field lay behind them, a shattered graveyard of Hive ships and debris. But the red markers on the map had not diminished. If anything, they multiplied, spreading like blood pooling from a wound. The Hive was regrouping, adapting, and closing in. "Commander," Major Cale Strain said as he approached, his tone clipped but measured. "The fleet's status reports are in. We've lost 6 ships entirely, and nearly half of the remaining vessels are operating on partial systems. Ammunition is critically low. Shields are unstable. Morale is—" He paused, his expression grim. "Fragile." Elias didn't respond immediately. His hands rested on the edge of the console, his fingers curling slightly as if trying to grasp something intangible. Finally, he straightened and spoke, his voice low but resolute. "How long until the Hive regroups?" "Less than 12 hours, Cale replied. "Maybe less, given how quickly they've been adapting." Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. Then we make our move now." The bridge crew froze for a moment, their unease palpable. Even Cale hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Make our move? Commander, we're barely holding together. The fleet needs time to repair, to regroup." "There is no time," Elias interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. He gestured to the hologram, highlighting the next system on their path. "This is our chance to end it. The Hive's central nexus lies here, buried deep within the Rinth system. It's the heart of their hive mind network. If we strike it, we cut the head off the serpent." The bridge filled with murmurs, voices tinged with disbelief and fear. Dr. Lyra Anto stepped forward, her expression equal parts incredulous and concerned. "You're talking about attacking the core of their existence, Elias. That's not just a battle. It's an all-or-nothing gambit. If we fail—" Elias turned to her, his gaze steady and unwavering. If we fail, we die. But if we succeed, we end this war. Every second we delay, the Hive grows stronger, and we grow weaker. There's no other path. Lyra held his gaze for a moment before exhaling softly. You've already decided. I have, Elias said, his tone softening but losing none of its conviction. He looked around the bridge, his voice rising to reach everyone. I know what I'm asking of you. I know the odds. But I also know this. The Hive sees us as prey, weak, fragmented, beaten. That's their mistake. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Around him, the crew turned their attention fully to their commander, their doubt beginning to give way to something harder, sharper. Elias's voice grew stronger, each word cutting through the air like a blade. They don't understand what it means to fight like we do. They don't understand sacrifice. They don't understand resolve. They adapt because it's in their nature. But we, he jabbed a finger at the map, we adapt because we choose to, because we refuse to lie down and accept extinction. That's what makes us dangerous. That's what makes us human. A quiet settled over the bridge, the weight of his words sinking into every corner. Even Lyra, who had always challenged him, nodded slowly. Harbinger, Elias called, turning to the AI's flickering avatar. Prepare simulations for an assault on the Hive's nexus. Prioritize infiltration tactics and countermeasures for bioorganic defenses. Simulations in progress, Harbinger replied, its voice calm and precise. Estimated time to completion, 6 minutes. Elias turned back to Kale. Get the fleet ready. Full combat readiness in 1 hour. Kale nodded, his skepticism replaced by grim determination. Yes, Commander. The Rinth system came into view like a maw opening to swallow them whole. The Hive's nexus wasn't a single structure, but an amalgamation of writhing bioorganic tendrils that stretched across an entire planet. Pulsing with sickly green light, it looked alive, as though the world itself had been consumed and reshaped into a monstrous engine of war. The faint hum of the Nexus's energy output vibrated even through the ironclad's hull, a visceral reminder of the enemy's overwhelming presence. Report, Elias said, his tone sharp but measured. Enemy fleet is forming a perimeter, Yaren reported, her fingers flying over the navigation console. Their ships are massing in layers, protecting the Nexus from all sides. Standard formation, Elias muttered, his mind already dissecting the tactical possibilities. They're expecting a direct assault. And we're not giving them one, Lyra added, stepping up beside him. Harbinger's simulations suggest a high-probability approach using cloaked insertion teams to disable key energy conduits. Once their defenses are down, the fleet can concentrate fire on the Nexus core. Elias nodded. Good. Coordinate with the insertion teams. They need to move fast and precise. Kale will lead them. Understood, Lyra said, turning to relay the orders. The final preparations were swift and efficient, the crew moving with a purpose born of desperation and determination. As the insertion teams launched, their ships cloaked and slipping through the Hive's perimeter like shadows, Elias watched from the bridge, his fingers tightening on the command platform. Status on the infiltration? He asked. Teams are in position, Yaren replied. Approaching the first conduit now. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavy with anticipation. The Hive ships began to shift, their movements erratic as if sensing something was wrong. They're reacting, Lyra said, her voice tight. We need to move fast. Signal the fleet, Elias commanded. Begin the assault. The ironclad surged forward, its engines roaring as the fleet followed in tight formation. Railguns and missile batteries lit up the void, their firepower converging on the Hive's perimeter. The enemy ships responded in kind, plasma streaking through the darkness in blinding arcs. The air on the bridge grew heavy with the scent of ozone and the faint, acrid tang of burning circuits. First conduit disabled, Yaren reported, her voice rising with urgency. Insertion teams are moving to the second. Hold the line, Elias said, his voice a calm anchor amidst the chaos. We need to buy them time. The battle raged, the void filled with fire and destruction. Hive ships moved with terrifying precision, their formations adapting to counter the fleet's tactics. But the coalition forces held, their unity forged in the crucible of desperation. "Second conduit is down," Yaren shouted. "Energy levels in the Nexus are dropping." Elias leaned forward, his voice cutting through the din. "All ships, target the core. Fire everything we've got." The fleet's weapons unleashed their fury, railguns piercing through the Hive's defenses and striking the Nexus directly. The monstrous structure convulsed, its tendrils writhing as explosions rippled across its surface. The green glow began to dim, flickering like a dying heartbeat. On the bridge, the crew erupted into cheers, but Elias remained silent, his eyes fixed on the collapsing Nexus. This was the moment, the turning point, the proof that humanity wasn't just surviving, they were winning. As the Hive fleet began to retreat, Elias turned to his crew, his voice steady but filled with unyielding resolve. "This isn't the end," he said, his words resonating through the bridge. "But it's the beginning of their end. They thought we were weak. They thought we were prey. They thought they understood us." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "They were wrong." The crew stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. The ironclad pressed forward, a battered but unbroken symbol of humanity's refusal to bow. The war wasn't over, but for the first time it felt winnable, and that, Elias thought, was what made them dangerous. The ironclad hung in the void, a defiant silhouette against the dim remnants of the Hive Nexus. The air on the bridge was charged, a fragile balance between triumph and the crushing reality that this war was far from over. The scent of overheated systems mingled with the faint tang of sweat and blood, a grim reminder of the price paid for survival. Elias Vaynor stood at the central command platform, his gaze locked on the holographic map of the Rinth system. The Hive fleet, though fractured, was still regrouping at the edge of the battlefield. He knew their retreat wasn't a concession, it was the gathering storm of vengeance. "Damage report," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the bridge crew. 17 ships lost, 5 more barely operational," Major Cale Strain replied, his tone steady but carrying the weight of the numbers. "Shields across the fleet are at 30% or less. Munitions are critically low. We're down to defensive capabilities only." Elias's jaw tightened, his fingers curling against the edge of the console. He didn't need Cale to elaborate. This was a fleet on the brink, one more major engagement, and they'd be done. He turned to Harbinger's glowing avatar, the AI's faint flicker mirroring the instability of their systems. "Harbinger," Elias said, his tone sharp but deliberate. "Run projections. What happens if the Hive regroups and attacks within the next 8 hours? The AI processed for a moment before responding, its voice calm and clinical. "Probability of survival, 12%. Success contingent upon immediate defensive consolidation and high-risk countermeasures." Elias exhaled slowly, his mind racing. 12%. It wasn't a death sentence, but it wasn't life either. He turned back to the map, his eyes scanning the surrounding systems. "Their regrouping is fast," Lyra Antos said, stepping closer, her voice laced with quiet urgency. "Too fast. The Nexus was supposed to destabilize them more than this." "It's their adaptation," Elias replied, his tone heavy with understanding. "The Hive's hive mind doesn't rely on one location. It's distributed, resilient. We've bought time, not victory." "Then what's the play?" Cale asked, his gaze steady despite the tension in his voice. "We can't outrun them, and we sure as hell can't fight them in this condition." Elias straightened, his expression hardening. "We take the fight to them, not just here, not just in this system, everywhere." The bridge went silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Lyra frowned, her sharp mind already dissecting his plan. "You're suggesting we split the fleet? Attack on multiple fronts? That's suicide." "No," Elias said, his tone unwavering. "That's strategy. The Hive adapts because they think we're predictable, linear. They don't expect chaos. We scatter, hit their weak points simultaneously, and force them to overextend. Every strike is coordinated to draw them away from their core. And what's left of our fleet? Cale asked, his voice tight. "We're barely holding together as it is." "We don't need a fleet," Elias said, his voice growing sharper, more resolute. "We need purpose. We need to show them that no matter how many of us they kill, we'll still be here. Fighting, bleeding, winning." The bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances, the enormity of the plan sinking in. Lyra stepped forward, her voice quieter now. "Elias, even if this works, even if we draw them out, we're talking about sacrificing what little we have left." "Sacrifice isn't failure," Elias said, meeting her gaze. "It's survival, and if we don't do this, there won't be anything left to save." The fleet split into 3 groups, each tasked with hitting critical Hive locations. The ironclad, battered but defiant, led the smallest of the groups, its mission the most dangerous. Their target, a secondary Hive nexus deep within enemy territory. The ship moved like a shadow through the void, its engines humming faintly, the scars of battle still fresh on its hull. Inside, the crew prepared in grim silence. The faint smell of disinfectant mingled with the acrid tang of scorched metal, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Elias walked the corridors, his boots striking the deck with deliberate rhythm. Soldiers and engineers snapped to attention as he passed, their faces etched with a mix of fear and resolve. In the war room, Lyra and Cale waited, their expressions somber as Elias entered. The holographic map displayed the Hive's nexus, a writhing mass of organic tendrils coiled around a pulsating core. "This isn't just about destruction," Lyra said, her voice measured. "If we hit this nexus, we disrupt their supply chains for weeks, maybe months. But the Hive won't let us get close without a fight." "They'll come at us with everything they've got," Cale added, his tone grim. "And we've got not much." "We have enough," Elias said, his voice steady. "We're not here to win a fair fight. We're here to end it." The plan was set. The ironclad would lead the assault, drawing the Hive's attention while insertion teams infiltrated the nexus to plant charges at its core. It was a high-risk operation with no room for error. The Hive nexus loomed ahead, a grotesque amalgamation of bioorganic tendrils and pulsating energy. The sight was both alien and horrifying, its sheer scale dwarfing the fleet. The faint hum of the Hive's power vibrated through the ironclad's hull, a constant reminder of the enemy's presence. "Contact in 60 seconds, Yaren reported from the navigation console, her voice tight. Elias stood at the command platform, his gaze fixed on the viewport. The Hive ships began to swarm, their glowing forms moving with eerie precision. The air on the bridge grew heavy, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. "All ships, engage," Elias commanded. The ironclad surged forward, its weapons blazing. Railguns and plasma cannons lit up the void, carving paths of destruction through the Hive's formations. The enemy retaliated with relentless ferocity, their bioorganic weapons streaking through the darkness in blinding arcs. "Insertion teams are away," Yaren reported, "approaching the Nexus core." Elias watched the display, his jaw tight. The Hive's ships were converging on the ironclad, their movements coordinated and relentless. Each hit sent shudders through the ship, the groans of its hull a haunting reminder of their fragility. "Hold the line," Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Give them time." The battle raged, the void filled with fire and destruction. The air on the bridge grew thick with the acrid tang of burning systems, the faint hum of life support struggling to keep up. But the crew held, their unity forged in the crucible of desperation. "Charges set," Yaren called out. "Insertion teams are extracting." "Disengage and retreat," Elias commanded. "We've done our part." The ironclad pulled back, its engines roaring as it accelerated away from the Nexus. Behind them, the charges detonated, a blinding flash of light consuming the Hive's core. The explosion sent shockwaves rippling through the void, tearing through the Nexus and the ships surrounding it. On the bridge, the crew erupted into cheers, their relief palpable. But Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed on the destruction. This was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. He turned to his crew, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. "They thought they could break us," They thought we'd give up, but they were wrong. The bridge grew quiet, his words sinking in. This isn't just a fight for survival, Elias continued, his voice rising. This is a fight for what it means to be human, to stand when others fall, to adapt when others crumble, to choose to fight, no matter the odds. The crew nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. The ironclad pressed forward, a battered but unyielding symbol of humanity's defiance. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, the Hive had learned fear. And that, Elias thought, was how they would win.